The prison yard was loud with shouting, metal doors slamming, and guards barking orders. But everything shifted the moment the new inmate walked in. A short-built man with a powerful frame, quiet, expressionless, hands hanging naturally at his sides. To the prison wolves, that meant one thing: easy target. The moment he passed the weight benches, the bullies closed in. A pack of men who lived off violence and smelled weakness like blood in the water. "Yo, shorty," the leader laughed, patting the top of his head condescendingly. "You lost, little man?" Kindergartens down the hall. His friends circled. One grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground. Another slapped the back of his head. A third poured a cup of hot coffee over his shirt. Inmates roared with laughter, but the short-built man didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. He simply adjusted his stance slowly, calmly, like someone preparing for something they'd done 1,000 times. The bully leaned down, sneering in his face. "What are you going to do? Hey? Punch my kneecaps?" That was the last thing he remembered, because in a single motion so fast no one understood what happened. The short-built inmate's hands flew up, gripped the bully's collar and flipped him over his own back using leverage and perfect technique. The man landed on the concrete with a crack that silenced the entire yard. The short-built man hadn't moved from his spot. The other bullies froze, not because he fought back, but because he fought with precision, technique, mastery, like a man who had trained every day of his life, using his low center of gravity as an advantage. Guard whistles exploded. Inmates stepped back, and in that stunned, breathless silence, the truth spread across the yard like wildfire. The helpless little guy was a kung fu prodigy who once won tournaments using techniques designed for his unique stature. And the men who mocked him had just awakened a fighter deadlier than all of them combined. Stay with me until the end, because what this inmate does next will flip the entire prison hierarchy upside down. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. David Torres had walked through those same prison gates for the first time. The intake officer barely looked up from his paperwork as the guards processed him through the system. Another body for the overcrowded facility. Another number in their database. "Assault charges," the officer muttered, scanning David's file. "Says here you attacked 3 men outside a restaurant. Witnesses say you went crazy. Put 2 of them in the hospital." David remained silent. His weathered hands folded across his chest. At 48 years old and 4 feet 10 inches tall, he'd learned that explaining himself rarely changed people's minds about what they thought they saw. The truth was more complicated than any police report could capture. Those 3 men hadn't been random victims. They'd cornered his daughter outside her workplace, demanding money she didn't owe, threatening violence if she didn't pay. What the witnesses hadn't seen was the 20 minutes of escalating threats that preceded David's intervention. What they definitely hadn't expected was a short-built man moving like lightning. But the system didn't care about context. The system saw a small man who'd somehow injured 3 able-bodied attackers, decided he must be dangerous, and locked him away. The judge had called it excessive force. The prosecutor had painted him as an unstable individual who used his size to catch victims off guard. Now he was inmate number 40829, assigned to Block C, walking himself through corridors that reeked of disinfectant and desperation. The other inmates watched him pass with calculating eyes. In prison, first impressions determine survival. Show weakness, become prey. Show too much strength too early, become a target for every wannabe tough guy looking to build a reputation. David had perfected the art of appearing invisible. His cellmate was a wiry Hispanic man named Martinez, who'd been inside for armed robbery. Martinez took one look at David's height and immediately claimed the bottom bunk for himself. "Hope you don't snore, little man," Martinez said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "And keep quiet at night. Some of us actually sleep in here." David nodded politely and began arranging his few possessions on the small shelf above the top bunk. A worn paperback book, a photograph of his daughter, letters from his martial arts students on the outside. Martinez noticed the letters and laughed. "What's this? Fan mail from the circus?" "Something like that," David replied quietly. What Martinez couldn't have known was that those letters came from students at the Torres Combat Academy. Students who'd trained under David for years, learning not just techniques, but philosophy. Students who understood that true strength often wore the mask of gentleness. David had opened the academy 15 years ago after years of being underestimated because of his stature. He'd adapted every technique he knew for someone of his build, developing a fighting style that was uniquely his own. His students called him sensei, the traditional term of respect for a martial arts master. But none of that mattered now. Inside these walls, he was just another inmate trying to serve his time without getting killed. The first test came during his second day in the mess hall. Prison dining was a carefully choreographed dance of unspoken rules and territorial boundaries. Each table belonged to a different group. The Aryan Brotherhood commanded the corner near the windows. The Latino gangs held the center tables. The black inmates controlled the area near the kitchen. Everyone else scrambled for whatever space remained. David walked to an empty spot at the end of a table occupied mostly by older inmates, men who'd learned that survival meant keeping their heads down and avoiding unnecessary conflict. That's when Big Mike made his entrance. Big Mike stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed close to 300 pounds. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of 2 decades behind bars. He'd earned his reputation by crushing anyone who challenged his authority, and he made it his business to establish dominance over every new fish who entered his domain. Well, Big Mike announced loudly, his voice carrying across the mess hall. Looks like we got ourselves a charity case. Conversations died as every inmate turned to watch the show. This was prison entertainment, watching the strong devour the weak, establishing the pecking order that kept the ecosystem functioning. Big Mike approached David's table with the swagger of a man who'd never lost a prison fight. His crew followed behind him like loyal hyenas, feeding off his energy. "You sitting at my table, shorty?" Big Mike said, looming over David. "That's my spot. You're warming it with your broke-down ass." David looked up calmly. "I don't see your name on it." The mess hall erupted in whispers and nervous laughter. Nobody talked back to Big Mike. Not if they wanted to keep their teeth. Big Mike's face darkened with rage. "What did you just say to me?" "I said I don't see your name on it," David repeated, his voice steady and clear. "If you want to sit here, there's plenty of room." That's when Big Mike made his first mistake. He reached down and grabbed David by the shirt, intending to physically lift him away from the table. "Let me help you find somewhere more appropriate for your kind," Big Mike sneered. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. David's hands shot up and locked onto Big Mike's wrists with iron grips. Using leverage and precise pressure points, he twisted Big Mike's arms in a direction they weren't designed to go. The giant man found himself bent forward at an impossible angle, completely off balance, his own body weight working against him. "You want to let go now?" David said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd controlled much more dangerous situations. Big Mike struggled, but quickly realized he was trapped. Any movement he made only increased his pain and worsened his position. The man he tried to intimidate held him as easily as a child holding a toy. "You're breaking my wrists," Big Mike gasped. "Not yet," David replied. "But I could." The entire mess hall watched in stunned silence as the prison's most feared enforcer found himself helpless in the grip of a short-built man. Guards started moving toward the disturbance, but David released Big Mike before they could intervene. Big Mike stumbled backward, clutching his wrists and staring at David with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Next time you want to move someone," David said calmly, "try asking politely first." He returned to his meal as if nothing had happened, leaving Big Mike standing there humiliated in front of 300 witnesses. That incident should have been the end of it. In a rational world, Big Mike would have learned his lesson and given David the respect he'd just earned. But prison isn't a rational world. It's a place where reputation means everything. And losing face can be a death sentence. Big Mike couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those calm, steady hands gripping his wrists with impossible strength. He'd been humiliated in front of the entire prison population, and in a place where respect was currency, he'd just been bankrupted. By morning, word had spread through every cell block, every corridor, every corner of the facility. The story grew with each telling. Some inmates swore David had lifted Big Mike clean off the ground. Others claimed they'd heard bones cracking. The truth was impressive enough, but prison gossip transformed it into legend. David knew what was coming. He'd seen it before in the martial arts world, where defeating one challenger only brought 10 more looking to prove themselves. Prison operated on the same principle. Except here, the stakes were life and death. The second wave came during yard time. 3 inmates approached David as he sat reading near the basketball court. They moved with the casual confidence of men who'd planned this carefully, timing their approach when the guards were distracted by a heated argument on the other side of the yard. "Heard you got some tricks, little man," said the leader, a scarred Latino named Vega, who controlled the drug trade in Block C, but tricks don't mean much when it's 3 against 1. David closed his book and placed it carefully on his lap. "You sure you want to do this?" "Already doing it," Vega replied, nodding to his companions. The first man lunged forward, expecting to overwhelm David with sheer aggression. Instead, he found himself grabbing empty air as David ducked with perfect timing, then pivoted with lightning speed. The attacker's momentum carried him past David, and David's fist caught him in the kidney with surgical precision. The man dropped like a stone. The second attacker tried to grab David from behind, but David had anticipated this. He reached back, grabbed the man's shirt, and used his low center of gravity to pull the attacker forward while simultaneously driving his elbow backward. The impact caught the attacker square in the solar plexus, doubling him over. Vega realized his mistake too late. He'd expected an easy victory against a short-built man. Instead, he was facing someone who fought like water, flowing around attacks and striking with devastating efficiency. David turned to face Vega directly. "Your move." Vega pulled a sharpened piece of metal from his sleeve. "A prison shiv designed to kill. Maybe you can fight, but let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding out." He thrust the weapon toward David's chest, but David caught his wrist mid-strike. For a moment, they struggled. Vega pushing down with all his strength while David held the blade inches from his heart. Then David twisted. The movement was so sudden and precise that Vega's grip opened involuntarily. The shiv clattered to the ground as Vega found his arm twisted behind his back, his shoulder joint stressed to its breaking point. "Drop it," David said quietly. Vega had no choice. The pain was excruciating, and any resistance would have meant a dislocated shoulder at minimum. By now, the altercation had drawn attention from across the yard. Guards rushed over, whistles blaring as other inmates formed a loose circle around the scene. "What happened here?" demanded Sergeant Williams, the head guard on duty. "Just a misunderstanding," David said calmly, releasing Vega, who immediately clutched his shoulder. "These gentlemen were helping me with something." The guards looked at the 3 men on the ground, then at David standing peacefully, and struggled to piece together what had occurred. The math didn't add up in their minds. 1 short-built man versus 3 healthy attackers should have ended very differently. "All of you back to your cells," Williams ordered. "Now." As the crowd dispersed, David could feel the shift in atmosphere. The looks he received were different now. Less predatory, more cautious. Word would spread again, and this time the story would carry weight that couldn't be dismissed. But David knew this was just the beginning. In prison, defeating enemies often created bigger enemies. And somewhere in the administrative offices, officials were already discussing what to do about the inmate who was disrupting their carefully maintained order. That evening, David received an unexpected visitor. Father Miguel Santos had been the prison chaplain for 12 years, and he'd learned to read the signs when trouble was brewing. The gray-haired priest knocked gently on David's cell door. "Mind if I come in?" Father Santos asked. Martinez was out for his evening shower, leaving David alone with his thoughts. "Please, Father." The priest entered and sat on Martinez's bunk, studying David with experienced eyes. "You've caused quite a stir in just 3 days." "Not my intention," David replied honestly. "I believe that, but intention and result are often different things in here." Father Santos leaned forward. "I've been asking around about you." David Torres, former martial arts instructor, short-built but never let it limit him, arrested for defending your daughter. David said nothing, but his slight nod confirmed the priest's research. The men you fought today won't let this go, Father Santos continued. Vega's connected to people outside these walls. People who don't appreciate having their operations disrupted. What are you suggesting, Father? I'm suggesting that your martial arts skills, impressive as they are, might not be enough for what's coming next. Prison justice operates differently than the outside world. David set down his book and looked directly at the priest. Are you offering me protection? I'm offering you information. There's a contract out on you. $500 to whoever puts you in the infirmary permanently. Word is it came from someone who doesn't appreciate the attention you're bringing to Block C. The news didn't surprise David. He'd expected retaliation, but he'd hoped to have more time to establish his position in the prison hierarchy. How long do I have? Hours, maybe less. They'll come tonight when the guards are light, probably during the shift change around midnight. David nodded slowly. He'd faced worse odds before, but never while confined in a locked facility surrounded by men who wanted him dead. There is one option, Father Santos said carefully. Protective custody, solitary confinement until your case can be reviewed for transfer. That's not living, Father. That's just surviving. Sometimes survival is enough. David shook his head. I didn't spend 15 years teaching students to overcome their limitations just to hide from mine. Father Santos stood to leave, then paused at the cell door. Your students speak very highly of you. They've been writing letters, trying to get your case reviewed. They believe in you. Thank you for telling me, Father. Don't thank me yet. Pray instead. You're going to need divine intervention for what's coming. As the priest disappeared down the corridor, David began his preparations. He'd learned long ago that the difference between a martial artist and a fighter was preparation. A martial artist trained for perfect conditions. A fighter prepared for chaos. Tonight would definitely be chaos. The lights went out at 10 p.m. as they did every night. The prison settled into its nocturnal rhythm of snoring inmates, patrolling guards, and the distant hum of ventilation systems. David lay in his bunk, fully clothed, listening to the sounds around him. Martinez had returned from his shower and climbed into the bottom bunk without saying a word. But David could tell from his breathing that his cellmate wasn't sleeping either. In prison, everyone could sense when violence was coming. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. David heard the shift change in the distance. The brief overlap of conversations as the day guards briefed their night replacements. It was the perfect window for an attack when confusion and distraction provided cover for activities that shouldn't be happening. The footsteps in the corridor were almost silent, but David's trained hearing caught them anyway. Multiple sets, moving with purpose, stopping outside his cell. The lock clicked softly as someone with access opened the door. David remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing, waiting for the right moment. His attackers entered the cell like shadows, confident that their target was asleep and helpless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first attacker moved through the darkness like a predator stalking prey. He carried a sock filled with batteries, a makeshift weapon designed to crush bone without leaving obvious evidence. Behind him, two more shadows crept forward, confident that their sleeping target would never see them coming. David waited until the man was directly above his bunk before making his move. In one fluid motion, he rolled sideways and dropped from the top bunk, landing silently on the cell floor. The attacker's weapon whistled through empty air where David's head had been just seconds before. What the hell? The man gasped, spinning around in confusion. David didn't give him time to recover. His hands shot forward, gripping the attacker's wrist and using his momentum to pull him off balance. The man tumbled forward, striking his head against the metal bed frame with a sickening thud. The second attacker lunged from the doorway, but David was already moving. He dropped low, using his compact frame to sweep the man's legs. The attacker crashed into the cell wall with bone-jarring force. The third attacker hesitated, suddenly realizing that their easy target had just disabled two grown men in under 10 seconds. Your friends need medical attention, David said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion. "I suggest you get them help." But the attacker pulled a razor blade from his pocket, the kind inmates fashioned from stolen commissary items. In the dim light filtering through the cell window, the metal gleamed with deadly intent. "They said you were supposed to be helpless," the man snarled, advancing slowly. "Maybe you can fight, but let's see how tough you are when you're cut to pieces." David remained perfectly still, his stance balanced and ready. To an untrained observer, he looked vulnerable, trapped in a confined space with nowhere to retreat. The attacker took the bait. He rushed forward with the razor extended, aiming for David's throat. But as he closed the distance, David demonstrated why he'd once been considered among the most dangerous fighters in the world, regardless of size. Using his low center of gravity as an advantage, David dropped even lower and drove his shoulder into the attacker's midsection with devastating force. The impact lifted the man off his feet and sent him flying backward through the open cell door. The man hit the corridor wall and slumped to the floor unconscious. Martinez sat up in his bunk wide-eyed with disbelief. "Jesus Christ, man. What are you?" Before David could answer, emergency alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Guard footsteps thundered down the corridor as the prison went into full lockdown mode. "Everyone on the ground now," Sergeant Williams shouted as armed guards flooded the cell block. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the 3 unconscious men scattered around David's cell. David raised his hands and remained motionless as guards surrounded him. He knew that any sudden movement could result in a beating or worse. "Check for weapons," Williams ordered. "Search everything." The guards found the razor blade, the batter-filled sock, and a sharpened piece of plastic that had been intended for David's ribs. They also found David standing calmly, showing no signs of injury despite being outnumbered 3-1. "Explain this," Williams demanded, gesturing to the unconscious attackers. "They came into my cell uninvited," David replied simply. "I defended myself." Williams studied the scene with growing confusion. The evidence suggested that 3 armed men had attempted to murder a short-built inmate only to end up unconscious themselves. The math didn't compute in his mind. "Medical teams are on their way," another guard reported. 2 of them are breathing but unconscious. The third one's got what looks like broken ribs. Williams turned back to David with new respect in his eyes. "You did this." "I did what I had to do to survive." As paramedics arrived to treat the injured attackers, word of the incident spread through the prison like wildfire. By morning, every inmate knew that the quiet short-built man had single-handedly defeated 3 assassins sent to kill him. But more importantly, they knew he'd done it without killing anyone. In prison, that kind of restraint was almost more impressive than the violence itself. Any thug could beat someone to death. It took a true master to defeat enemies while showing mercy. The next few days brought unexpected changes to David's daily routine. Inmates who had previously ignored him now nodded respectfully when he passed. The weight room fell silent when he entered, not from fear, but from genuine respect for his abilities. Even more surprising were the requests that began coming his way. "Yo, Torres," called out a young Latino inmate named Ramirez during yard time. "My cousin on the outside, he studies karate, says you used to be some kind of teacher before you got locked up." David looked up from his book. "I taught martial arts, yes. Think you could show me some moves? Not to hurt nobody, just for protection." The request caught David off guard. In all his years teaching, he'd never considered conducting classes inside a prison. But as he looked at Ramirez, he saw something familiar in the young man's eyes. The same hunger for knowledge that had driven his best students on the outside. "Why do you want to learn?" David asked. "Because I'm tired of being scared all the time," Ramirez admitted. "I got 18 months left on my sentence and I want to walk out of here knowing I can protect myself and my family." Over the next week, word spread that David was considering teaching again. Inmates began approaching him with similar requests, sharing stories of vulnerability and desperation that reminded him why he'd become an instructor in the first place. The idea crystallized during a conversation with Father Santos. "You've been given a unique opportunity," the priest observed during one of their evening talks. These men respect you in a way they've never respected authority figures before. Respect born from violence isn't the foundation I want to build on, David replied. Perhaps not, but respect born from defending yourself against violence, that's different. You've shown them that strength doesn't always come from aggression. David considered this perspective. Throughout his teaching career, he'd emphasized that martial arts were about discipline, self-control, and protecting others. In prison, those lessons might be more valuable than anywhere else. The warden would never approve formal classes, David said. The warden doesn't need to know about informal conversations during yard time, Father Santos replied with a slight smile. Sometimes the most important education happens outside official channels. That weekend, David held his first unofficial lesson. 5 inmates gathered around him in a corner of the prison yard, away from the guards' direct observation. David began not with fighting techniques, but with philosophy. Before you can control your opponent, you must first control yourself, he told them. Anger makes you predictable, fear makes you weak, but calm awareness makes you dangerous. He demonstrated basic breathing exercises, teaching them to find stillness even in the chaos of prison life. Then he showed them simple defensive positions that could be practiced in their cells without drawing attention. The goal isn't to hurt people, David emphasized. The goal is to protect yourself and others while maintaining your humanity. Young Ramirez absorbed every word with intense concentration. How do you stay calm when someone's trying to kill you? Practice, David replied. And understanding that your response in those moments defines who you are as a person. As weeks passed, David's informal classes grew larger. Word spread beyond Block C, drawing inmates from across the facility who were hungry for something more than the daily cycle of violence and desperation. But success brought new challenges. The prison's established power structure began to view David's influence as a threat. Gang leaders who maintained control through fear and intimidation saw his message of self-discipline and peaceful strength as dangerous to their authority. The first warning came through Martinez, who'd been approached by representatives from the Aryan Brotherhood. They want you to stop the teaching, Martinez told David one evening. Say you're disrupting the natural order of things. And what did you tell them? David asked. I told them you'd probably stop when you felt like stopping and not a minute before. David smiled at his cellmate's growing confidence. Martinez had been attending the yard sessions, and the change in his demeanor was remarkable. The second warning came directly from Big Mike, who cornered David in the library. You think you're some kind of savior? Big Mike asked, his voice low and threatening. Teaching these punks to think they're warriors. I'm teaching them to think, David replied. Nothing more dangerous than that. Big Mike's face darkened. You're making enemies, old man. People who run things around here don't appreciate competition. I'm not competing with anyone. I'm just sharing knowledge. Knowledge can be dangerous in the wrong hands. David looked up at the giant man who'd once tried to intimidate him. It can also be liberating in the right ones. The confrontation ended without violence. But David knew the pressure was building. His students were becoming more confident, less willing to accept abuse from established bullies. The prison's social ecosystem was shifting, and those who benefited from the old system weren't happy about it. The breaking point came 3 weeks later during an incident that would change everything. A new inmate named Thompson had arrived on Block C. A young black man, barely 21 years old, who'd been convicted of drug possession. Thompson was small, quiet, and obviously terrified of his surroundings. He made the mistake of accidentally bumping into Vega during dinner, spilling gravy on the gang leader's shoes. You clumsy piece of trash, Vega snarled, grabbing Thompson by the throat. You're going to lick this clean or I'm going to make your life very uncomfortable. The mess hall fell silent as inmates watched the familiar ritual of a predator establishing dominance over prey. Under normal circumstances, Thompson would have submitted, beginning a cycle of abuse that might last his entire sentence. But something different happened. Ramirez stood up from his table across the room. Leave him alone, Vega, Ramirez said clearly. The kid didn't mean anything by it. Vega released Thompson and turned to stare at Ramirez with murderous intent. "What did you say to me?" "I said leave him alone. He's new. He doesn't know the rules yet." Other inmates began murmuring in amazement. Nobody challenged Vega directly. His reputation for brutal retaliation kept even the toughest prisoners in line. But Ramirez stood his ground, his breathing steady, his posture calm but ready. David recognized the stance immediately. It was exactly what he'd been teaching in their yard sessions. "You got a death wish, little man?" Vega asked, advancing on Ramirez with his fists clenched. "I got a problem with bullies," Ramirez replied. What happened next would become prison legend for years to come. Vega charged at Ramirez with the fury of a man whose authority had just been publicly questioned. His massive fist swung in a wide arc aimed at crushing the younger inmate's jaw. But Ramirez wasn't there when the punch arrived. Using the footwork David had drilled into him during their yard sessions, Ramirez stepped aside at the last possible moment. Vega's momentum carried him forward, off balance and vulnerable. That's when Ramirez struck, not with anger, but with surgical precision. A quick strike to Vega's solar plexus doubled him over. A controlled elbow to the back of his neck sent him crashing to the mess hall floor. The entire sequence lasted less than 5 seconds. The mess hall erupted in chaos. Inmates jumped to their feet, some cheering, others backing away from the confrontation. Guards rushed toward the disturbance, but what they found defied every assumption they'd made about prison dynamics. Vega lay unconscious on the linoleum floor while Ramirez stood calmly above him, hands at his sides, breathing steady. The young man who'd been terrorized by bullies for months had just defeated one of the most feared inmates in the facility. And he'd done it using techniques that looked suspiciously familiar to anyone who'd been watching David's yard sessions. As guards dragged Vega to the infirmary and questioned witnesses about what happened, the real story began to unfold. Word spread through every cell block that the quiet, short-built man hadn't just been defending himself all along. He'd been building an army of inmates who refused to be victims anymore. Men who'd learned that true strength came not from hurting others, but from protecting themselves and standing up for those who couldn't stand up alone. David watched from his table as Thompson helped Ramirez explain the situation to the guards. The young man's hands weren't shaking anymore. His voice carried confidence that hadn't been there an hour ago. That night, as David lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the prison settling into darkness, Martinez spoke from the bottom bunk. "You know what you've done, don't you?" his cellmate said quietly. David smiled in the darkness. "What's that?" "You've changed this place. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not permanently, but you've shown people something they forgot was possible." 6 months later, David Torres walked out of prison a free man. His conviction had been overturned on appeal, thanks partly to new evidence and partly to testimony from inmates who'd witnessed the transformation he'd brought to the facility. But his real legacy remained behind those walls, in the quiet confidence of men who'd learned to defend themselves without becoming predators, in the unspoken code that protected new inmates from veteran bullies, in the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. David Torres had entered prison as victim number 40829. He left as something much more dangerous to the systems that prey on the helpless. A teacher who'd shown broken men how to rebuild themselves from the inside out. Sometimes the greatest victories don't come from defeating your enemies. This has been Behind Bar Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Let us know.